Hi there, I'm Jackie from Bloom Property Management, and I'm here to show the follow-up of my previous video as to why letting tenants repair holes in their walls is a terrible idea. So go and watch that video for more information on that. But here's where we're up to on that repair. So I've scraped off about that much plaster off the tenant's previous repair job to this wall, and the finish was bumpier than New Zealand road, so you'll know why I did. And if you have a look at that previous video, you'll see that this repair is now a lot bigger than the other one was because I've had to feather out the plaster right to the edges and so on. Now, I'm a competent amateur. I'm by no means a professional with plastering, and I only do it for my own investment properties. Do not ask me to do it for your investment property. It will not be something I agree to, and it won't be the best value for money for you either, because I will charge an exorbitant rate and you will get a competent handyman result. Go and get a plasterer. So anyway, now that we've plastered this, the next question is, what do we do now? Now, I hate to tell you landlords that, even though perfect is the enemy of done, you don't just go and slap on top coat now. I'm sorry, but there's still a stage to go. So the next thing to do with plaster work, because it's not sealed, it won't have a nice finish unless you put an undercoat sealer on there. So my tips for undercoat sealers is firstly, go and get a good one and make sure it's suitable for the job. And then always mix things before you use them. And to make it easier to handle in the job, I get a container like this, which is just a peanut butter jar, and I label it with a Sharpie to say that it is undercoat, because you'd be amazed at how quickly you'll forget what white paint is this as opposed to a ceiling paint or a window frame or whatever other paints you've got in jars like this. So make sure you label them, and I do it on the body of the jar rather than the lid because lids can get swapped. Now I put it in here because it's a nice convenient size to hold. So it is comfortable in my hand. I'm not using the tin and getting stuff potentially back into the tin or flakes of paint that'll fall in and ruin the finish. So this keeps it nice and clean. It also means that if I'm taking a break from my job, I just put the lid back on and it keeps the paint nice and fresh, and that'll actually keep it good for months. So I don't have to worry about tipping it back into the paint bucket when I'm done. I can just have one of these jars called undercoat and I keep it next to my tin of semi-used paint if need be at home. And so if I'm doing a little job, I can just grab my undercoat container and away I go. Speaking of taking breaks from jobs, if ever you're taking a short break to have a snack or whatever on your job, drink of water, always wrap up your brush. So I recommend using like a plastic bag, like a bread bag is perfect for putting a brush in. Just put it straight into the bottom of the bag, wrap it tightly around the brush to exclude any air, and it keeps it moist, ready for the next time you start painting. Now you don't want to do it for very long like that, so it's fine for a lunch break, but I wouldn't do it overnight unless you also stick it in the fridge. And any longer than that, definitely wash out your brushes properly. Now, as brushes, should you get good brushes? Yeah, well, look, I've been an investor for a long time now, and when I started out, I definitely used cheap brushes because that's what I thought I could afford. Turns out that it was a terrible mistake. So this property here, which I last redecorated 20 years ago, I was just sanding some woodwork and I discovered some bristles from a paintbrush that I used then. So it came out in the paint and it was no good, so I've had to pull them out of there. And so they're the ones that I saw were still in there. I hate to think how many I actually pulled out that I noticed while I was doing the job. So good paintbrushes tend not to drop bristles, and if they do, there's something seriously wrong. Go back to your supplier. But getting a decent brush really is worth the investment. They can be $100 or so, and it seems like a lot of money for a paintbrush. And if you treat them as disposable, then yes, it is very expensive to go through brushes for your jobs like that. It's much better to clean out your brushes properly and look after them. And when you're rinsing them, you want to get right in and get all the paint coming out. There should be no water, no colour to the water when you're cleaning out your brushes by the time you're finished. And definitely work it right into the base. There's a few things that we like to do, like we wrap up the bottom part of the bristles and the ferrule, that's the metal bit, with painter's tape before we even start painting, and that helps protect that from getting all painty, and only dipping 1/3 of the brush into the paint at any time. You will get more paint up the bristles, but it won't be right up into here and completely ruining your brush. So there's techniques you can use while you're painting that help preserve your paintbrushes as well as get a great finish on your job. So so worth investing in paintbrushes. We now spend the money on decent ones so that we don't regret the kind of things. This one is a rat tail brush, which means that it's on a slope, so your eyes are not deceiving you. It is on an angle, and that means it's really good for cutting in around trim and things like that, getting a nice sharp edge to the paint so we don't need to tape everything before we paint. So it takes a steady hand and a lot of practice, but again, I'm a competent amateur at this, but I can do it, so anyone can. So I was talking about plaster. If you don't put undercoat on your plaster before you put your top coat on, it's always going to show up. So even the smallest thing that you, like tiny little hole that you fill, whether it's a pinhole or a screw hole or something that you've put plaster over to fill it, do put undercoat on before you top coat. If you don't, the paint is going to absorb differently into the plaster as it will to the finished pre-painted wall beside it. And you'll get what looks like a really dull patch, and it'll look darker and rougher than the rest of the room. So your patch, even though you may have done a fabulous job plastering it, will still stand out. So you want to make sure that you've covered your bases by getting good undercoat on there, and maybe even go and do it twice, because if you're using white undercoat on white plaster, it can be easy to go snowblind, as we call it, where you stop seeing where you've covered and where you haven't. So it's a good idea to go back and do it a second time just to make sure that you've covered everywhere. And then when you get around to doing your top coat after that, it will go on beautifully, it'll be smooth, it'll look glorious, and your repair jobs will absolutely disappear into the finish. No one will ever know. So if you want more tips on how to prepare your property for renting and fixing damage like this, and presenting it well for the next property, follow me, and I'd love to talk to you about managing your property if you're in my area. So I'm Jackie at Bloom Property Management, and I look forward to being better together.